Welcome to WG University, Weber Gallagher's series of educational programs. I'm Tom Girallo, and I'm presenting today with Rob McMahon. If you would like to view this webinar again, share it with others, or see our other WG University programs, please visit the Weber Gallagher website, www.wglaw.com, and you'll find copies of this presentation and others under the WG University page. Also, feel free to contact the firm with any questions at questions@wglaw.com. Today's presentation is a fun one. It's Dram Shop, Gram Shop, medical marijuana and what it means for bars. With that, we're going to get started together. We thank everyone for joining us today. We're very glad to have you and hope you find this to be an interesting topic. What we want to talk about today is the idea that with liquor liability cases and defending bars on Dram Shop type cases, particularly here in Pennsylvania and in a host of other states, we're likely to see a real change in how these cases are handled with the advent of medical marijuana being legalized and regulated in a variety of states, including our home state here, Pennsylvania. We expect that to sort of change how these cases come about. We want to identify that for folks out there to say this is something you should be on the lookout for. And I think that, and Rob, I think you'd agree with me, I think one of the things that we have to really all be prepared for is kind of relaxing how we think about marijuana and understand that it's something that's going to factor into the claims world, whether any of us sort of personally like it or not.
That's absolutely right, Tom. Everybody who is watching the news and is staying abreast of these developments is starting to realize, and if you haven't started to realize, you better, that society's perception and the way it treats those who use pot or marijuana has been changing, dramatically changing, particularly over the last 10 to 20 years. And you see it in TV shows, you see it in movies. I remember back in the 70s, it was rare when a movie would reference marijuana use, and when it did, it generally was negative or a negative perception. Now you can't see a mainstream comedy that doesn't have a pot scene where somebody gets high and they think it's funny and they giggle. It's often used in many modern day comedies as a source of fun and humor, and I do believe that that is a direct example of how society's perception of those who use marijuana is becoming much more open-minded.
Along those lines, we didn't want you to just have to kind of take our word for it. So here's a couple of pot perspectives for you. Of our former president, Barack Obama, who's in one of his books, I don't think pot is more dangerous than alcohol. Again, whether you agree with it or not, here's somebody else's perspective. And then the always well-recognized pot advocate, Martha Stewart, saying, of course I know how to roll a joint. And then maybe a little more serious, Jocelyn Elders, our former Surgeon General, marijuana does not impact others around an individual as much as alcohol does. What matters most about looking at these things is not whether or not anyone personally agrees with them. It's that some people really believe it that way, and it's sort of permeating our culture, excuse sort of the pun there, that it's something we're all going to have to confront, deal with, and understand in the claims world. And I think that one of the biggest areas of it is certainly going to be when its interactions with alcohol and cars and bars and all those sort of things. So here's sort of the gist of this presentation. Suppose this guy walks right into your bar. You want to know. Your bartender wants to know. Your waiter or waitress wants to know. Your manager wants to know. Is he visibly intoxicated? Right now, you're concerned with, did he have 5 shots of tequila and then come to your bar? Is he drunk? Is he high? Do you have to ask him these questions? What do we do? That's the point of this, is to say there's sort of a new lens in which to look through this. For a little background so that you actually do know, the kid in this picture is from a late night talk show clip and actually admits to being high, so you get an answer there. But you're not always going to have the benefit of that perspective in your bar, but these are the types of questions we come across, certainly in the cases.
For carriers and claims adjusters who deal with the underwriting of establishments that serve alcohol, it is still somewhat of a big mystery how the government's going to react as the pot use and the allowed use of marijuana begins to grow, particularly from legal and from civil lawsuit perspectives. The very first thing I think we can anticipate with regard to how we react as bartenders or establishments that serve alcohol with people who come in and who appear high, at the end of the day, it's going to still be a judgment call by the bartender and by the sellers of alcohol. And it'll be up to that gatekeeper, as I always say to my clients who are bars and establishments that sell alcohol, that the bartender holds a very important job. He is somewhat the gatekeeper of society and society's desire to alter their own consciousness. He or she has to be the person that makes that judgment call as to whether or not to serve someone. The touchstone law is still that you cannot serve someone who is visibly intoxicated. And if the judgment maker makes the judgment that the person appears to be high, then my advice is you don't serve that person, because they're already visibly intoxicated, no matter what the intoxicant is. It could be oxycodone or OxyContin or any of all that plethora of pills that are now available out there. Marijuana, could be cocaine, could be meth, whatever that judgment maker perceives, it is his or her perception that's going to rule the day. And bartenders have to be trained to look for signs of intoxication, and also have to be trained to have the confidence to make that decision such that, hey, I'm not going to serve this guy or gal. They look messed up. And once they look messed up, you cannot serve them.
I think sort of fundamentally the idea is broadening the definition of what intoxicated is in a visibly intoxicated person under the law. As Rob said, it doesn't matter what the intoxicant is. It's broadening that definition and having the understanding that that is getting broader every day in a legal sense. So here's a little background on where our home state of Pennsylvania has now recently shifted to. And considering that we were a state with pretty blue liquor laws for a long, long time that are only just getting relaxed, the marijuana train has gone pretty fast over the last couple of years. Act 16 was signed last year by our governor. It allows doctors to prescribe marijuana to registered patients who have an appropriate ID card. This is the 24th state in which to do something along those lines. I think it's reasonable to suggest that the dominoes will continue to fall in some way, shape, or form, and you're going to see that number continue to grow. What's interesting, especially from someone who does general liability law, are the conditions that are allowed for you to get a marijuana ID card. There's very serious ones, Lou Gehrig's disease, cancer, glaucoma, things along those lines, things that you would routinely expect. But then we highlighted this one particular definition: severe, chronic, or intractable pain of neuropathic origin. What in God's name is that? To me, that reads like your typical slip and fall complaint where they say aches, pains, and random neuropathies. That one seems ripe for exploitation to me. I don't know what you think, Rob.
There's also going to be, there are several people, or probably thousands of people, from what I'm told from my friends in California, from clients in California, that it's fairly easy to get that prescription card. And I think almost any chronic pain complaint or anxiety can get you a prescription. So you're dealing, the basic bottom line is, if you really want to get a pot prescription card, at least in California, you can get it. You'll go in the family doctor and you'll tell your family doctor, I have anxiety, I'm nervous, and that's good enough. With regard to what constitutes severe pain or intractable pain of neuropathic origin, I'm going to tell anybody out there that it could be anything.
Yeah, it's a herniated disc.
Yeah, I think you'll start to see people who hold prescription cards are going to start making the argument, and I think this will come out soon, that you can't discriminate against them and that they're going to be a protected class. So when they get turned down for service at a bar or at a marijuana store, I think they're going to start making the argument that they're a protected class. I'm not sure if that's developed yet, but I think that's on the horizon. So that's going to add to all sorts of interesting stew of litigation, I'm sure. From what I'm told, and again, we don't have medical marijuana stores in Pennsylvania, at least not yet, but from what I'm told in California, that sellers in the stores are being trained, not unlike bartenders, that they are not to serve those who come in to buy the marijuana, even with the prescription card, if they appear high or intoxicated already. So they are now being told to treat it just as if they would if they were a bartender and somebody came in and appeared drunk. They are not to be served. It is now they are giving similar instructions to their sales clerks to not sell pot or marijuana to someone who appears to be high.
Sort of following up on that with a little bit more of the law is the Act 16 says here are certain things that patients who use marijuana can't do. And there are things that you would reasonably expect, like operate heavy machinery, drive a car, about 8 or 9 other things along those lines. Again, general sort of awareness. Oddly enough, it doesn't mention alcohol at all expressly. And I can't really give you a good reason as to why, but I think that's significant that it's not there. That to me leaves open some legal loopholes. At the same time, I want to point out, I think just about every doctor is going to say, hey, don't mix alcohol in the marijuana when you're using it properly. You really shouldn't be doing that, sort of like every doctor tells a patient to stop smoking, tobacco. But and the medical advice issue, I think, is going to be a big deal in some of these cases. But it's strange that for the time being, the regulations don't expressly tell you that is something you can't do.
Another concept here that's growing in society is the use of edibles. So you may not be able to detect someone that smells like marijuana from smoking it or from having it on them because it has a strong odor. But also now people are eating it in various edible forms, and that's another sort of different aspect that bartenders are going to have to be aware of, and also sales clerks in marijuana stores.
Sure. And so the state is creating, a framework for dispensaries and growing operations for marijuana. I think some of those licenses are actually going to be awarded this week, if I'm not mistaken. There's a whole series of rules for doctors to follow. There's clearly, an avenue to do this in a regulated and sort of proper way. So that's all out there to legitimize the issue and make it something that's medically recognized and medically necessary. But as with just about anything else, and painkillers are a huge topic right now, and I sort of see some parallels there. There's clearly going to be opportunities for exploitation and sort of bending of the rules. And that seems to have a whole host of issues that spills over into other places, and one of them being liquor liability in bar cases, which is obviously what we're focused on today.
I think as attorneys, we can anticipate that the litigation and then the anticipated growth and explosion of litigation is going to sort of frame and influence the legislation that will arise from all of these concerns. For example, there have already been wrongful death actions in Colorado brought by family survivors of those who have been murdered by people who have been high, who have been proven to have had a significant enough cannabis level in their bloodstream. So there has been wrongful death actions brought against the marijuana providers and the marijuana producers, which is sort of interesting because the corollary that we keep making to alcohol, you cannot, lawsuits against, for example, Tom, the Smirnoffs, they're not recognized.
Sure.
In a dram shop case. You can't sue the person who manufactured the vodka. But there have been wrongful death suits against pot producers now in Colorado. I can't say for sure for Washington, but I know I've seen them. I've done some research and I've seen them in Colorado.
And so we want the, we've already alluded to this already, but we want, the folks who insure bars and restaurants and so forth to start educating, some of their insureds and then by extension to people who are, the foot soldiers and the bartenders and so forth. What are the signs of impairment? I'm not going to read every one of them to you, but the similarities between alcohol and marijuana impairment are there. And those are the things you're already trained to look for the alcohol signs if you work in a restaurant. When I was a bartender for a couple of years, you took the tips class every year. They taught you everything that you had to do about it, keep an eye out, and the signs are there.
By the way, excuse me, Tom, you're going to see probably a growth in the tips and ramp type class now for pot use.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's down the road somewhere, but it'll rise.
I think it's going to be absolutely necessary, and they're all going to sort of be merged into the training for bars to say these are all the things you got to look for now, because there's a lot of crossover between alcohol and marijuana. But if you have sort of the more subdued marijuana reaction that some people have, and you're just kind of wandered into a bar, it's not the same boisterous behavior that's commonly associated with being intoxicated on alcohol. Someone who's aggressive and fighting. It might be just sort of your Willie Nelson walking into the bar saying, "Can I have a beer, man?" And that's not as much of a red flag in the human experience. But now everyone's kind of got to be on the lookout for it.
And there's a lot of overlap between the signs of alcohol use and the signs of marijuana. Red eyes was the classic. What's the old saying? The eyes are the doorway to the soul. That's very true when it comes to intoxication. Your eyes are generally your giveaway spot for almost any drug use. Almost any intoxicant has an effect on your eyes, whether it be your irises or whatever, your pupils contracting and expanding, bloodshot eyes, things like that. But yeah, I always told, and I've in classes given to bartenders, always say, look at somebody's eyes right away. Now, you can have red eyes or watery eyes or glassy eyes from using Benadryl or having allergies. So it isn't an exact science, nor would it ever be, and this is where we get back to, it's really the perception and the judgment of the gatekeeper. The person who is dispensing the intoxicant has to make a judgment call, and that's a lot of pressure, but they're going to have to live up to it.
Yeah. Especially with so much crossover between these things. So we've touched on this a little bit. The bartenders are required to be on the lookout for it, and it's not an exact science, as Rob just said. Marijuana totally complicates this issue, and it's going to be more difficult. And there's a whole host of questions as you're evaluating somebody in the bar or restaurant setting that you're gonna be maybe asking for the opinion of your coworker, have them bring an extra plate over and kind of survey the situation. There's going to have to be some human tricks to it to try to make a better and informed decision, because one of the things that stands out from some of the medical literature is that actually the interactions of alcohol and marijuana are rather unpredictable. There's not really a uniform standard for it where they say, hey, 75% of the population does this, 20 does this, 5 does this. They're really finding a lot of variables with it, and that probably only increases with products like edibles. And so much of this then falls back on bartenders being trained and servers being trained to make their best judgment, think about these issues, and really engage with the customer, which is always a big part of the training, offering things like water or extra food to sort of draw them out in conversation and also give them things that help sort of sober them up a little bit.
It'll always help to have two bartenders on duty if you can during at least the busy hours, say from 7 p.m. till midnight. Tom's right. I've always interviewed bartenders when I've had dram shop cases and asked them, did you ask somebody else whether they thought that person was intoxicated? Even if it's just a bar back, just somebody else who maybe back up that person's judgment call, or get another opinion. What do you think? Do you think this person looks intoxicated, looks impaired? I always say to the bartenders, keep a notepad. I know it sounds dorky, but keep a notepad under the bar and make a quick note if you think somebody should be looked at again. Once you've served them once, you want to keep an idea, at least mentally, of how many drinks they've been served and has their behavior changed. Contrary to popular belief, it's not illegal for someone to get drunk in a bar. It's just illegal once they appear drunk to be served. They could come in looking as sober as a church mouse and then proceed to get intoxicated, and they're still fine with 6 or 7 beers as far as their looks. Once they look messed up or intoxicated, they cannot be served.
So we've already kind of touched on these suggestions, so I'm gonna breeze through them a little bit. You're looking for updated training, perhaps guidance from your particular state, is forthcoming or already on the table. The screening of the patrons we've talked about. And if there's ever a concern, like, hey, reach out to your manager and say, all right, I'm worried, or I at least have that seed of doubt. What do we do? And we really touched on this in the beginning, operating under the assumption that the word intoxicated and visibly intoxicated person has to be broadened in its definition. And I would imagine that all of this is going to encourage the bar and restaurant industry to continue to look at some of the strategies they've already done. Very often in cases you hear them say, look, we tried to get the guy in a cab, we called him a cab. Updating that a little bit more, we helped him arrange the Uber on his phone, he gave us the access to do that, or something along those lines, trying to minimize risk. But at the same time, I think maybe the most important part is going to be dialogue amongst coworkers and updated training to identify these issues with actual patrons and actual restaurants.
I would also suggest to those carriers or TPAs that underwrite, again, establishments that serve alcohol, by all means, they should be posting signs if and when marijuana becomes legal in Pennsylvania, or medically so. They should be posting signs that say, we reserve the right to deny service to anyone who appears intoxicated on marijuana, or appears to be under the influence of marijuana. It doesn't hurt at all. It only helps you in a lawsuit that you had those signs posted.
So let's touch on some of what the actual cases look like. We know what a typical dram shop case looks like from the plaintiff's perspective. Guy goes to a bar, he's either already drunk or drinks too much while he's there and has a personal injury event or car accident of some type or gets in a fight. Plaintiff claims they were improperly overserved, they were already exhibiting signs of visible intoxication, and they continue to give him a beer or a shot or whatever. And then you get into the investigation. What was the guy's BAC? What was his behavior? What was he doing? Was he slurring his speech and so forth? And how obvious was this to all the other folks there? And then you get into the depositions of the Cliff Clavins of the world, finding out how drunk somebody was while they were sitting there. Move on to experts who come in and say, your training policy was inadequate. The bartender obviously should have seen this. This is, a toxicologist will say, this is what somebody at point 20 exhibits physically. How did you miss this? And very often in most of the dram shop cases I've been involved in, they're usually pretty serious personal injury events, because I think the most common event is a car accident of some type, but they're rarely minor dram shop cases. Most of them are sort of medium to above in terms of exposure and damages, so they're serious cases.
You'll see an interesting development from a science aspect too, if indeed the Commonwealth goes the way and starts to legalize marijuana. You'll see an interesting science aspect develop as far as the correlate to the BAC and alcohol. Mm-hmm. It's so much harder to measure the presence of cannabinoids in someone's bloodstream. It can be detected, and it's detected in at various levels, but the science of it will become, when did they smoke or ingest it, and how long has it been in their system? You can test positive for marijuana. What they said, I'm not sure, but I've always heard it ranges from 28 to 35 days after it's been used. Obviously, someone who smoked pot or ate a pot cookie 25 days ago probably isn't still intoxicated, it's still in their bloodstream. So the science of it's going to be really interesting how that develops, because it's not going to be as cut and dried as your blood alcohol content.
Very often we're defending these cases. A couple of sort of standard avenues you look at from the outset. The plaintiff was not exhibiting the obvious signs. Rob touched on it before. There was someone who had 6 or 7 beers, but they still kind of handled themselves well. They didn't really give those outward signs. You're always worried about in these cases sort of the quiet guy in the corner. You never really know. That's where some of the training and the drink counting and the engaging with customers training comes into play. But you're trying to say, hey, he wasn't slurring his speech. He just kind of wandered up. Nothing seemed off to me. And there's sort of the gatekeeper judgment call aspect to it there as part of the defense. You're always looking at, hey, the plaintiff sort of shouldn't get himself that drunk. The plaintiff shouldn't jump in a car and start driving after that. Plaintiff should have arranged a designated driver, gotten a cab, gotten an Uber, something along those lines. The personal responsibility realm, you're looking down. You're always looking at the BAC issues and the science of that, and that's obviously why Rob knows some of that so well, because it's something you're really going at, saying, boy, how does that extrapolate? When was the high point of the BAC? Because it may not have been until well after they left the bar, but they were tested in the emergency room. That's always an issue we're looking at. But at the time they were served the drink, the BAC was likely much lower, so they probably weren't showing the signs. I think the science says your BAC spikes about 45 minutes after your last drink, so you could be well out of the bar and cause some sort of event. Those are always issues you're looking at. And then you're always evaluating the guidelines of your establishments as to how they train their folks and whether all the training was on time and in touch with state protocol and things along those lines.
Yeah, another interesting aspect will be how the science of it. Different people have different metabolisms, and particularly with the edibles, the way they're absorbed into the bloodstream. It'll be interesting to see how the science develops. Also, we're so used to, as a society, you hear it all the time. People have this what I call the myth of legally intoxicated. You see it, newspapers use it, television coverage, they'll say, oh, someone was legally intoxicated. Well, there is no legal intoxication. There is just the Commonwealth's standard, along with many other states, that say if you have a .08 or above alcohol in your bloodstream, then you are not able to reasonably and responsibly handle a motor vehicle. So it's a legal limit for the handling of motor vehicles. There's no such thing as a legal definition of intoxication. And the corollary again on the marijuana side is the government hasn't decided yet what's the presence of cannabinoids in the bloodstream or in the system that makes you unreasonably fit to handle a motor vehicle. So you'll have to see how that science develops too, but I'm sure it will eventually.
So we're looking at the idea of trying to, put on an ugly hat and think like a plaintiff's attorney. and look at where there might be opportunities to broaden these dram shop cases to incorporate these issues when they come up, because they will come up. And so they're going to say things like, well, this guy was obviously high. There's no doubt. Go back to the picture of the guy I had at the beginning who admitted to it. Say, you shouldn't give this guy a beer if he asked for it, not even one. And that is tough stuff, but I could see it happening. Saying you refused him service completely. Pretty often you feel like the judgment call could be, all right, this guy's kind of quiet, it's fine. You can have one beer, we'll kind of figure out where he's at. Maybe, the plaintiffs take the approach of it's one beer too much already. And that a server should have understood, yeah, this wasn't a rowdy dude. This was kind of just like your regular sort of low-key guy, and you should be able to spot that. You should be trained to spot that. Medical marijuana is in the news every day, and you guys have a responsibility as somebody who serves alcohol to look out for these things. So keep an eye out for those things. With the plaintiff being prescribed marijuana use and having it backed by a doctor, does that sort of undermine the personal responsibility angles that we look at? They say, hey, look, we're already in, somewhat compromised physical shape to the point where we needed medical marijuana. That is a very open-ended question and will really play on sort of people's attitudes, but it's a possibility of something to look at, almost as a sympathy angle, which could be surprising, but I could really see it happening. And sort of a cheap pun here, but there's going to be a whole new crop of experts that are going to come up. And it might be on things like blood alcohol content of cannabinoids and what that impact is and what those standards should be and what you should be allowed to do. And certainly the bar experts and the folks who already comment on policies and procedures of a bar in these types of cases, they're going to sort of broaden their horizons to begin discussing this stuff. And maybe the most interesting part of all of this is we might have new defendants in our cases that we have to deal with. Sometimes you get the dram shop cases that have 4 bars because the plaintiff bar hopped all night. Well, now do you have a dispensary maybe brought in? Do you have a doctor brought in? Are you making your own claim back against the plaintiff for maybe misusing the marijuana? There's all kinds of things that are going on in there. Now, some of the law itself protects the doctors from civil liability for these things, but it's not necessarily clear if it extends to how they give advice. And that could be a whole host of issues that are out there that are, I would imagine, the plaintiff's bar considers to be an opportunity.
I think if we do hit that point where, such as Colorado or Washington, or Los Angeles, even though theirs are medical, or California, you're going to see an explosion of lawsuits against the distributors of the marijuana. And maybe the doctor has some type of shield writing the prescription, but the dispensaries don't. And I think there'll be an explosion. And if Pennsylvania goes that way, where we have even medical dispensaries, I think the dispensaries themselves will be held liable. I think they'll be brought into the legal suits, and I think the power of the plaintiff's bar will make it thus.
Yeah, I mean, their lobbying effort's always significant, and this is probably a way that they might think they can make some money, and that's what does it. But we're looking at some of the issues to counteract that. So obviously we have to get on the discovery ball earlier about marijuana. Make sure that this isn't something that's part of the plaintiff's medical history. And if it is, go learn about it. What does your card say? What does your prescription say? Who's your treating doctor for that stuff? And what advice did they give you? Because that's the part that I think is going to be big for defense attorneys, is to say, your doctor told you to stay away from alcohol when you were using this stuff. Did you do that? Medical malpractice cases all the time, they're always concerned about whether or not the plaintiff was still a smoker, particularly in cancer diagnosis cases and so forth, and continues to do so against medical advice. I don't see that as being a whole lot different here, except to me it really looks like an issue of contributory or comparative negligence to say, you knew, you were warned, you were given this very serious process that you signed up for to get a medical marijuana card. Your doctor said, avoid alcohol for, let's say, 8 hours after you use it, or whatever the advice might be. You didn't do that. You had some, and then you went out to the bar with your buddies. I see that as maybe the biggest way to, shall I say, blunt an aggressive plaintiff's claim.
Yeah, again, you'll have to see the science grow in that, because with the comparative negligence aspect, if the plaintiff is a user and had been told not to mix it with alcohol but still did, you're going to see probably a slew of motions in limine to preclude any reference to that But I do think it'll be harder and harder to preclude those references as it gets more out in the open. It's going to be one of these. It's going to be another factor that's considered with the evidence.
Yeah, especially because it's going to be part of their medical history, and they put it all at issue in the case and so forth. It's not nearly the same illegal prejudice to it that typically comes with it. There's more of a medical context to it.
I think you'll see it come in cognitive deficit claims.
Yeah.
If someone's making an argument that they can't concentrate, memory and things like that, and if they're a legal marijuana user, I think it'll be another aspect to be considered. I think experts will be allowed to consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we touched on the comparative negligence and saying, did the doctor advise you to just stay away from alcohol? And if not, is that a problem for the doctor in the case? And so we really want to broaden that and consider making that really relevant for jury consideration. Again, going back to the blood test we touched on earlier, I've read some stuff about marijuana sort of maybe enhancing VAC. I don't think it's a settled question. I'm not suggesting that it's 100% rock solid. But as Rob keeps rightfully pointing out, the science is going to emerge, and I think it's all going to play into, from the defense perspective, a comparative negligence type aspect, and opening up what we're allowed to speak about in front of the jury when it comes to this issue. And those are really new areas of exploration. I think there's going to be a lot of untested opinions. We'll touch on that in a minute, that we have to look at, take seriously, educate ourselves about, and probably one of those things where once we feel confident about it, engage with experts earlier in a case so that we're better informed for things like depositions and stuff like that to get going on this type of issue when it's been spotted in the case.
I think an example of that, I do believe, again, if we move in the direction of medical marijuana, I think all ER physicians or intake personnel are going to be required to ask the person, do you have a medical marijuana card, or do you use medical marijuana?
Yeah, and it might even, I'm not sure it's going to happen tomorrow, but a couple years from now, you might see the actual blood test in the ER sort of broadened to include this stuff. Normally, you see white blood cell count and that sort of thing, and then maybe they test for alcohol. The further drug tests might become a little more standardized, and they happen sometimes when the cops suspect it. You certainly see it in ER records, but it might become a little more standardized, and therefore, in a lot more cases, because the information is there one way or the other. As we've been alluding to, and one of the things we started at the outset is we all have to kind of look at this issue through as different of a lens as we can, because there's going to be a lot of perspectives coming at it if we're thinking about juries and mediators and judges and so forth. Some folks might be against the use of marijuana on a moral or religious ground, and we have to see if we can understand that and apply it to the case, and there's a million ways you could apply it. Are there folks who are very pro-law enforcement and have family members who are, police personnel and so forth, and they just feel like, hey, we shouldn't be legalizing this, and they sort of have some different perspectives coming at it that way. Millennials and Rob, as you said at the open, it's much more common to see in movies and TV, and that it's something that's sort of part of the dialogue as opposed to being a major plot point or something like that. It's an easy joke. It's much more commonly accepted in the media. So when you have folks like millennials who kind of grew up with that, do they feel a little more comfortable about it? And I think there's a good chunk of people in that category who say, like, I don't think twice about it. I don't really care about it one way or the other. And they're pretty relaxed about it.
Excuse me, Tom. Those of you who have teenagers, ask your kids the general consensus of what the high school kids are saying. In my experience, talking to teenagers now, they look at it like it's not that big of a deal anymore. And I think those are the people who are going to sit on your juries in 8 years, 7 years.
At least one of them is going to pop up on your jury pretty soon.
Yeah. Yep.
And there definitely is a segment of the population that feels that way. And look at this poll we stuck in here. This was, Franklin and Marshall, they do a lot of the big political polling for this state. And this was part of one of those political polls. 56% of the voters say legalize it. Whether you agree with that or not, that's a very substantial number, and it moved really fast between the last time they conducted that poll. I think it was either 6 or 9 months prior. It was below 50%. That's a big jump for an issue like this, very swiftly.
I think the only variable, though, is contrary to the popular acceptance of marijuana, is the way the millennials and the teenagers view driving. Though because they've been conditioned about the dangers of driving while intoxicated. I think they tend to have opinions very critical of those who drive while they're doing, while high. So I think that's where the future goes in 10 years when these kids sit on juries. I do think, as a defense attorney, if you have a plaintiff that drove while high, I think there will be a certain amount of, as the kids say, judginess in that jury.
I think you're right. So we just kind of want to wrap up and say, thank you for your time here today. We're really glad to have had the opportunity to speak to you and sort of identify some of these issues. There's going to be a lot more to come on this, I think. Something we're going to keep checking up on, keep research, and keep applying to our cases in all likelihood, because it's all coming our way, whether we like it or not. And it's one of those things that I think there's just going to have to be dialogue, not only between bartenders and their managers and their servers, but between lawyers and claims personnel and risk managers and underwriters and so forth, because this is not going anywhere.
Just remember, litigation shapes legislation, not the opposite.
We thank you very much for
Thank you.
all your time today. We really appreciate it.